Hello and welcome to the Joy of Editing with Dave Kelly. On today's episode, it's all about photo art. I'm going to show you some of my processes for coming up with a photo art image, starting out with a traditional photograph. I'm going into Topaz Studio 2 using three of my favorite filters. That would be texture, impression, and AI remix. So without further ado, let's get started. Well, here's the image we're starting out with, and hopefully it'll end up something that looks like this when we're done. It'll probably be a little different because they never come out quite the same. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is duplicate the background layer, and that's Command or Control J, depending whether you have a Mac or PC. Next thing we want to do is come up to Filter and come down to Topaz Studio. Topaz Studio 2, and we'll launch right into Topaz Studio 2. Now we're inside of Topaz Studio 2, and like I told you earlier, this is a three-step process. The first step is to come to Add Filter, come down to Texture, and get the Texture filter. All right? The next thing I like to do is we'll grab a texture here, and I like to start out with, let's go to Category All, give it a click, and come down to Meredith Images, because she has a lot of really cool painterly type textures, and I like to start out there. And let's just start out with this one called Blue Coverlet. All right, right there. Next thing I want to do is come up to opacity. You don't have to follow this procedure exactly, because you could put the opacity up first if you wanted to, but let's pull the opacity the whole way up, and you notice our image goes away. Secondly, I like to come down, or in this case, it would be thirdly, take saturation, take it the whole way off, so you get a black and white image. And then come up to the blend modes and either choose overlay or soft light. In this case, I'm going to choose overlay. Either one of those will work. It doesn't really matter. Just to start out with. You can always tweak this later to your heart's content. All right, so already you see we have some nice sweepy lines going on in here. It's very painterly already, but it is a texture and it's not a painting look yet. Now here's where the magic comes in. Above texture, I'm going to add an impression filter. And watch what happens to this image when I do. It's pretty cool, right? Because what happens is, let's shut off texture. Let's shut the eyeball off to texture and see what happens. This is what impression would do without that texture background. Kind of boring, right? I mean, it's not bad. It's a very toned down painting right at this point, but watch when I turn texture on. See, now we got some nice bold brush strokes back in here, and I really like that, so this is part of the technique. The next step is kind of important, I feel, and just slide on down through impression and come to texture, and I've showed you this in the past, but come down to background type and click on original. All these little like white lines and things in here could be distracting. Give that a click, and that takes most of those away. All right, so now we can come back up to the brush strokes up here. So now you can come here and go through the different brush strokes here. Now let's just leave it where it defaults at, but we're on type 1, but let's click on another brush stroke. See if you like a brush stroke there that kind of, if something speaks to you, say, that's the one I'm going to use. And I think I chose the actual first one because I thought it looked really good. Actually, that one's not so bad there. And you can keep clicking away through here. Let me go back to the first one. There's the first one, and what was the other one I liked? I think it was this one. I'm sticking with it. Type 09, you are my brush. Now the next thing I like to do is come through the number of strokes. You can select low. You can select medium, or you could select high and see how they interact with your image. And I think I'm going to go with medium because I like some of the details up in here. And then you can play with your paint volume. You can play around with that a little bit. Maybe just give it a little bit. We can play with our paint opacity if we want. I don't want to go too crazy here. I want to keep it kind of on the subtle side of things. Maybe right around there. You can play with your rotation, stroke rotation a little bit, maybe just a little bit, and your rotation variation. It's all subjective. You just play and have fun. It's part of the joy of editing, right? Just being able to play around. We can play with our stroke width, see how that interacts with our image. You know, and it plays with the details, gives me a little more details in the horse. I'm going to take a lot of this effect off the horse, by the way. We can play with our stroke length. Not going to play around too much, but you can spend your time here and take all the time you need and get it right the way you like it. And you can play with your spill. Give it less spill. Give it more spill. Actually, if you give it less, you see more of that texture coming through there. So I actually don't like that as much. So I want to get rid of some of that. So I'm going to give it a little bit more spill. And I think right around there looks pretty good. Here's another one. I don't mess with the coverage too much, but the smudge, if you want to soften your image, you can pull that up a little bit and soften it up a little bit. I want to keep that painterly look to it, so I'm going to leave the smudge off. I'm not going to touch coverage, but the painting progress, let me pull this back a little bit. And you can see some details starting to pop back in on the trees and the horse's eye and things like that. Again, I'm going to take most of this effect off the horse, and you'll see. But maybe something like that looks pretty good for now. And you could come down and you can add a texture. I'm going to leave the texture off. Now, if you were going to make a print on a canvas, you definitely don't want to turn your texture on. But if you're going to make a photograph, you can turn the texture on. But for my vision today, I want to keep the texture off. Now, we could go ahead and play with the color, the lighting, and all the other things here. But I don't want this tutorial going too long, but feel free to play with all that stuff because it may enhance your image and make it look better. But for now, I think I'm pretty happy with the way things are. So I'm going to keep this a little on the shorter side. I want to show you how these filters interact with each other. So let's go on the texture filter and let's come down to like where you see the detail, the brightness and contrast. Let's go to detail. Watch how things change when I bring this detail up. Okay. You can see more of the texture coming through there, or I could pull it back. But also, impression is working with it. As I change texture, impression is also changing. Okay, so things are happening there as well. So you can play with this. So you can come back and retweak your texture a little bit. So I might want to maybe pull that back a little bit. So you can play around in here. You can adjust the brightness of that texture. You know, lighten it up, darken it down, whatever you think. And I'm thinking maybe a slightly darker right around in there. And the important step here is to remember at the beginning where I kept that saturation turned off. That's important for this little technique that I'm showing you here. All right. And then we can come back to impression and we can play in there some more too if we wanted to. We can work with our brush strokes and things like that. The next step of this technique is to come to add filter and get an AI remix filter. But this is very important. You want to take this AI remix and drag it below impression. So impression is affecting everything under it, all right? And that's very important in this technique. So now we're in AI remix. So what I'm going to do is take the opacity and pull it way back. But look how that is really coloring my image. Now I'm using the colors in this first thumbnail here, a neon rise to kind of color my image. And this is the effect I used on the initial image that you saw when we started the video out. But that looks nice, and you can take this opacity and you can adjust it up and down. You can play with these blend modes too, but I find normal works pretty well for me. So I'm going to leave it on normal, but feel free to play with those blend modes. All right, and you can adjust this opacity for however much or less you want here. But it's very important to have it underneath the impression, so don't forget that, okay? And we can go through and try some of these other ones out here. They're all going to work a little differently with your image. That's kind of pretty. I actually like that, actually. That's Autumn Dreams. And let's try one of these guys here. This is a really crazy one. What's the name of it? Bokeh Hue. All right, so this one, you'd have to really pull it back. Okay, but it adds some little swirls and balls of color in there. Let's try this guy, Bold Mosaic. And play with your opacity. And again, don't forget you can play with your blend modes, but you can do different things here. And that's not bad. I think at the end of the day, I'm going to come back up and click on Autumn Dreams. I like this. I like how this is affecting my picture. And let's take the opacity, see if I want it more. But it's adding some nice coloring to the image here. Adding some nice warmth to the sky. And so I think it's adding to the blues here in the foreground. Let's click Autumn Remix off and on. So you can see what it's doing. It's kind of tinting the picture, and that's really what I'm using the AI Remix for, to actually tint my picture. And remember, impression is affecting each of these filters here, so that's very important. So I think I like that a lot. So the next step is to take this back to Photoshop. So just come back, come up to the upper left-hand corner of the interface and click Accept, and that'll bring us right back into Photoshop. The next step is to hide everything we've just done in Topaz Studio 2. So right now we're on the background copy here. So I would recommend that you rename your layers. I don't really have time for it right now, but I would recommend that you do that so you don't forget what you're doing here, okay? But what I'm going to do is Option click a layer mask icon here, which puts a black layer mask hiding everything. And the next thing I want to do, make sure we're painting with white paint. Make sure you have a brush. If you don't have a brush, you can use the shortcut B key to get a brush. And make sure you have white paint. If you don't, you can hit the X key. That'll toggle between your foreground and background paint. And I like to keep my opacity 100%, keep your flow at around 10%. The shortcut to get your flow at 10% would be Shift 1. That'll bring your flow to 10%. Now I'm going to start out in the foreground, and I'm just going to start to paint that painterly effect into the foreground here. Okay. And at 10% flow, it's going to build it up slowly. Okay, so I'm just going to paint along here. I'm trying to stay away from the horse. And I'm just kind of looking for painterly effects back in here, like this barn looks really nice with some painterly effect. I don't mind if I go over the horse a little bit. I'm going to actually apply this effect to the horse as well. I'm going to come up into the sky here and swirl around here. If you overpaint, we can always change to the opposite color paint, which would be black, and erase messed up areas. I want to keep a little bit of that going onto the horse a little bit. And in here, and just paint as much or as little as you need, and you can always erase off. I'm just going to paint a little bit over the horse here. In between the horse, over here a little bit. Now, I think I might have painted too much of my barn in here, so I'm going to go tap the X key to get me the opposite color. And I might take my flow even lower. I'm going to do Shift 0.5 to go down to 5%. Painting with white, I just want to take a little bit off of this barn back here because I want us to see this barn. And I just might want to lighten up this area right back in here. Okay, then I can always go with the opposite color and kind of blend that back in a little bit. Just very gently enjoy it. See that barn back in there. I just want to see a little bit of that barn. I like what's happening over here. I might want to darken this a little bit. So let's go with, I'm on white. So I can just paint this here a little bit, darken this area up here. Right around in here, maybe a little bit in here. I think we're looking pretty nice. Maybe darken this here, darken in between the horse here a little bit. Foreground, I want a little bit darker, and I want it to get lighter as it goes back to the background. I might lighten this area up here. Just tap X and lightly paint over that area right back in there. Okay, let me go to white paint again and paint up in this corner. I want this as dark as I can get it. Make sure I got a lot of paint up in there, somewhere around in there. And now let's make sure we are on white paint. And I'm at that 5%, so I'm just going to paint a little bit on the actual horse himself, just to bring him into this whole image here. Going very lightly with that 5% flow, so not a whole lot is getting in there. So somewhere right around in there. And isn't that beautiful? I missed a little spot over here, so let me continue to paint that at this 10% flow. You got to really paint away, but it helps you get a lot more control, so you don't have to, you know, you're like, oh my gosh, I got way too much paint. But that 10% or 5% flow is really going to help control your brushing. So it helps to have the flow down low so you can get more accuracy in your painting. And I might just darken that a little bit right up in there. Okay, and just take your time and just really get it right. I might have to darken this area right in here just to match it up. And if you overpaint your horse, just switch to the opposite color and just paint some of that off. But I think that looks really pretty. I love what's happening in the horse in here. Looks like he's running through the field. I just think it's beautiful. Let me know what you think. I think I missed a little bit around the horse area. I got to darken this area up in here a little bit. Looks a little bit light. Actually, I'm painting with the wrong color. X, Dave. I'm sure you'll do that too. I'm leaving that in. I won't edit it out. So, all right there. And if you overdid your horse, just tap the X key, get a little smaller brush. And I actually think it looks okay, but I'm just going to paint around there a little bit. Okay, something like that. That looks really good. We're almost done. The only thing we need to do is pull this image all together. In other words, take all these layers and stamp them up to a new layer, and that's Shift, Option, Command, E, and that puts them on their own new layer. And of course, you could rename that if you wanted to, and I do recommend that, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. Then we're going to come up to Filter and come back to Topaz Studio 2, give that a click and launch Topaz Studio 2. We're just going to add some precision contrast to bring some details out in this horse and some in the background in this barn here. So let's go to Add Filter, and we're going to go to, I don't know if I said precision detail, but I meant precision contrast. All right, so I'm going to take the micro contrast up, take it up a good ways here, somewhere around there. And I'm just looking at the horse, like, you know, the mane here on the horse and the eye and in the head of the horse. Bring that up. And let's try the low detail, see what happens there. I'm just looking for little details to pop a little bit. Now we'll bring up medium, see what we get there. I don't think I'm going to do too much with medium, pretty much leave it where it is. Let's try high details. I like what high's doing in the horse here. Now this is affecting the contrast, the larger areas of contrast. Okay, so somewhere in there. I like the way that horse is looking in there, and it looks like the muscles are really powerful in here, and that tree looks cool, and that barn looks really cool. Let's click on the canvas. There's the before and after. Okay, now I don't like what's happening in the entire image, but we're just going to go ahead and accept that. So come up to the upper left-hand side of the interface and click Accept. That brings us back to Photoshop. Option click a layer mask in Photoshop. That puts a black hide all layer mask. Now I'm painting with a flow of 5. I'm going to change that to about 30%. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and type the 3 key, and that puts us at a 30% flow. I'm going to make my brush smaller with my bracket key here. I'm going to start with the horse here. Make sure I'm painting with white paint. If I'm not, you can tap the X key to change it. And I'm just going to paint some of that detail, or contrast actually, which is affecting the details as well, right in here on the horse, on the hair, or the mane I should say. I'm going to do some on the legs here. Again, I'm at a 30% flow, so you don't want to swirl around too much. Every time you swirl around, you're adding more and more of the white paint. So I just want to be very careful here. Maybe paint around here a little bit in this area of the horse here, maybe in the back here, just a little bit. Maybe take my flow down a little bit to maybe 20%. So I'm going to hold Shift 2. I'm going to paint some over this tree here, a little bit on this barn, mainly on the front of the barn here and a little bit on the side, off to the edge there. I'm going to tap the X key, take it off of what I just painted here, because I wanted to leave the roof of that barn kind of soft. I'm going to hit the X key again and just make sure I'm painting with white paint just right across the barn here. And I might go down to about a 10% flow. That would be Shift 1. Make my brush a little bit bigger with the bracket key here. I just want to paint a little bit on this tree here, in this area in here, just to bring a little bit of that detail out. Now we have a nice big brush here, very soft, very low flow of 10%. We're just going to paint some across the foreground here, just to bring a little bit of detail into that foreground area. Paint a little more at the bottom here. Okay, and right in here just a little bit. And let's click on the eyeball. Here's the before and here's the after. And I think that looks really nice. If you felt you went too much, you can pull this opacity back. Now, let's look at the before and after here. So here's the before, here's the after. And let's option click the original background layer. So here's the original image and here's the painterly image. I think it looks really nice. What do you think? Well, there you have it. We took a photograph and turned it into a piece of photo art. That's one of the many techniques I use to make photo art. I wanted to share that with you today. I've had requests to show viewers how I do this kind of stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it today. If you like this video, please give it a like and share it with your friends. And also, if you're not yet subscribed to my channel, please subscribe and click the bell notification icon. This way, every time I put out a new training video, you'll be informed. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on The Joy of Editing with Dave Kelly, and I'll see each and every one of you right here